the Albany area. I'm one of nine library council directors that make up the Empire State Library Network. So welcome. ESLN has been working with a group of academic library directors across the state to see how we can best help them. And what's been coming um, up over and over again is the need to tell your stories. So when I saw this book was coming out, I reached out to Dr. Kate McDowell, and I'm really thrilled that she was able to present for us today. She has been making the rounds, sharing her story. So we're really glad she could be here with us. So I'm going to hand it over to Kate, and thank you all for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathy and Susan, for these introductions. It's nice to be here with you all in New York today. So I am going to tell you about the book, but I'm going to start with a story because it really begins for me with years ago when I was sitting around a table with other librarians discussing our building renovation project. We were lucky enough to have a building renovation project. Some of you will have had this, some of you will not have had this, and both are stressful situations. So we were staring at draft blueprints because we were dealing with a basement area that we needed to keep the square footage of the library going. But the old concrete ceiling was a waffle ceiling. I don't know if you remember those. They're like squares with like one can light in the middle. So if you just held a book right, you might be able to get under the light. And it was impossible, we thought, to raise the room's height. So we could do that, or we couldn't really do that because it was concrete. It's structural concrete. And then we couldn't really cover it up and add lighting because the ceiling would be even lower and we knew the space would feel super small. So we were staring at the data, the blueprints, the architect's challenges. And the one thing we had was a library director who was smart enough to involve staff deeply in this conversation. And suddenly, one of my colleagues had a brilliant idea. She said, "Why don't we dig the floor deeper?" And that is exactly what we did. And so the basement of that library feels airy and open today because there's a ramp in one side and stairs on another side. And the ceiling height is really a normal height. It's something that I always like to say, I don't think AI could have come to that conclusion. We were people sitting around a table with all the data, and we had trouble coming to that conclusion. So storytelling for libraries is sometimes about making sure we can talk amongst ourselves in ways that will then translate out. And I'll talk quite a bit about the research that I've done to get here. This is the content of the book. I won't be able to cover it all today. I'll talk a little bit, though, about critical storytelling which involves looking at power. I'll talk a little bit about data, and we'll cover some of these other pieces. I won't talk about storytelling against misinformation today, although I've also done misinformation research, as you'll see. I'll just talk about resilience. So we'll talk about history, data, audiences, and resilience with a little interlude there for a couple of key narrative structures that combine information and emotion especially effectively. So, with history, let's start with the history of our own field, which is that we have 130 years of storytelling in library and information science. Augusta Baker at the top right, with an unknown young library patron, was the first to hold the position of storytelling specialist at the New York Public Library. She set the philosophy that we still work with today, which is that we emphasize the story rather than the storyteller. We are just the vehicle through which the beauty and wisdom and humor of the story comes to listeners. And I understand that you may not think of those things as in your data yet, and they may not be, but you can tell true stories that get worked into this direction. My own background is also as a storyteller. I come from this tradition and I am part of this tradition. Carolyn Hewins with the fabulous hat, we will come to later as one of the first women to run a public library in Hartford, Connecticut, who also eventually developed the research methods that defined how our field moved forward with survey methods. And she's not known as much as she should be. And finally, at the bottom right is Dr. Betsy Hearn, my own mentor at the Center for Children's Books from around the time when I was doing and finishing my PhD in 2007. So I've been at this for 20 years now as a professor. I've also been doing consulting work for over a decade. In the bottom left, you see a few of the talks that I've given. I've given 40, it's over 40 invited talks in the last 3 years talking about this. book now, but of course, before it was an IMLS funded project I'll talk about too. I work regularly with Carly, so I'm very familiar with academic and research libraries, at least in the Illinois context. I've also worked with a lot of national organizations. As you can see here, I was keynote speaker for events hosted by COSLA in last spring and IMLS the spring before, and I've done international work in Denmark, Taiwan, and Norway. Speaking of international work, I was one of a handful of people brought in to talk about storytelling and misinformation in 2021. I was part of a year-long project to try to understand how we could use how we could use the inevitable at that point, viral spread of misinformation. We called it the infodemic that accompanied the pandemic, um, and take that as an opportunity to tell true, compelling stories that would pull in the other direction. So I worked mostly with medical folks in that context. And I've left off some of the consulting that was with environmental groups or sustainable agriculture. But I've done a lot of different kinds of consulting. Mostly this is the library focus slide. I also teach both storytelling and data storytelling, and I've done these things for a long time with big teams. My data storytelling teams, since you know now I'm the storyteller, include Dr. Matt Turk and Dr. Jill Naiman, both of whom are astronomy PhDs. They have massive data set experience. And Matt Turk invented these standards, YT it's called, for sharing astronomy data. So if any of you are science librarians or connected to astronomy, you might be interested in looking up YT and Dr. Matt Turk's work. So we teach ethical and engaging information communication because we need it. We need research to make impact beyond the academy. That is what my next book is planned to be about. But for now, let me stop and say I also know what I know and bring to you today insights from the Data Storytelling Toolkit for Libraries, which is again with Matt and Jill. The Public Library Association is my collaborator on this. We are creating these interactive pathways for common data storytelling needs. And in fact, this is the toolkit, and I will share it with you. It is still under development, but we have a demo version. I always like to say scroll down, and then you can see our 4 modules. These two are static tutorials. These two are interactive. I would say the strength right now and the place we've done the most development in the second grant is the motivations and goals section. So I'll put that in the chat for you all. Just some of you are multitaskers and I relate. So if you want to look at that while I'm talking, that is not something we just made up based on our expertise. We also did a lot of research, and I want to pause to express tremendous gratitude to all of the participants. In the end, I sort of put workshop discussions, but we had a core design team with about 40 people, and then we had about 50 people in the structured focus groups. We've had a few other high-profile individuals help us as well. So in all, it's 100 librarians that have helped us at every level of career, at every level of responsibility. But we've been talking with real librarians. This could not exist without so I would say these are our insights, but they are not ours alone. These are, you know now I come from the storytelling tradition. The goal is to distill the wisdom of the field. And the storytelling tradition is paramount here. This is not simply about taking data and putting it into story form, although that is challenging, and we'll talk about that. It's also not a delivery of story from teller to audience. The way that our field frames storytelling, and if some of you are familiar with JASIS, the Journal of the Association of Information Science and Technology, I have an article from 2021 called Storytelling Wisdom in a Paradigm Shift special issue that is about this sort of detailed theory behind this. I could actually share that link if that's helpful. Just let me know in the Q&A. So the idea here is that this looks very simple, and I know that, but it's deceptive. There is a storyteller tasked with telling a story. There is an audience receiving some version of the story and also having a connection to that storyteller. But the audience has their own connection to the story, and this is what makes it different than information delivery. Storytelling includes a deep respect for audience. Children, families, all the people who come from that tradition, they are going to have their own versions of the story. They're going to make their own meaning out of it. They're going to do their own investigations or pick whatever reading they want to pick after that event. So this relationship is one, so this is one of your takeaways. If you haven't thought about this before, it is not enough to just put story into data form. You need to think about this dynamic because the audience is aware of how you know your story. That means sometimes you, as experts on the library, are the best people to tell the story. It means other times you, as experts on the library, need to step back and let someone else tell the story because the audience will be less convinced sometimes if you are being paid to do the work than if you are someone whose life was impacted by it or a volunteer, a trustee, an allied faculty member. We will talk later about who tells your stories because this is an important part. We cannot be there to tell all the stories we need to tell. We have to make sure that other people are telling our stories when we're not in the room. But since we're talking about connections to audience, and thank you so much, everyone who posted a bit about your locations. I know some of your locations. I've been to a couple of your locations, which was fun to see. I wonder if you would put in the chat a one word, or it could be a phrase, answer to this question, which is, how do you make sense of information most? Which do you rely on more? So your answer could be data, story, both, or neither. All are good answers. Feel free to pick a word or make a phrase. Thank you, Mickey. So good to see you here. So far, the boths have it. That has been the largest growing. I've been doing this question now in my workshops and talks for a long time. How many years? It's 2025. For 5 years, I've been asking this question. Both is the Yep, both in documentation. Yep, absolutely. And I would call that your in-person conversations. That's right, right? Because we are not performers, we are here to make sure that people can hear us. Now, if you're a data or story or neither person, neither people are especially welcome here because hey, everything will be fresh. It's not how you approach it. But please feel free to put in the chat your approaches. Um, yeah, we need to narrate data. That's kind of the way I've been thinking about it for this next book. We need to narrate data. So let me look back and tell you some definitions. So data storytelling, it's any presentation of data using narrative strategies in story form. In my research, some of which I published in Public Library Quarterly, because I've also worked extensively with public libraries, I found two struggles in this, an article on obstacles to data storytelling in libraries. The first one is library stories are treated as ephemeral. So we pass them around with inside the organization, but we do it informally. We don't capture those stories and we don't think about our outside audiences who might benefit from knowing them. Um, the other, learning, great. The other is we are all storytellers, but it is not always easy to translate data into story. So one of the issues we've found pretty consistently are ways that data is collected and stored, but not storied. So I often say we need to have story before storage. For example, and I think this happens for good reasons. Partly we're very, very good at collection and storage. But for example, I did once in 2023 have a workshop where a librarian in the discussion part said she was having real trouble getting data from the expert who collected and analyzed it at her library and asked for advice. How can I persuade this person to like open the jar, right? So we can consume the data. The metaphor is the kitchen here because data does go stale and we must use it before it is too late. In this workshop, a second person raised their hand immediately and said, I'm the data person and nobody ever asks me for access to the data. So we started talking about these disconnects, and we found a couple of things, and these have come up in the research as well. People, people trying to make quick decisions. I relate to this. I've been an administrator and an academic since myself. I was interim associate dean for academic affairs in the iSchool at Illinois. We talked about how people imagine that a specific data point will be so decisive that they don't need to know any context or accurate interpretation. I also ran into this in Denmark when I was at a public library there, and a woman told me that a local politician wanted to know which costs less, real physical books or ebooks. And she was panicked because she knew the answer would lead in a direction that they would stop buying ebooks and buy more physical books. And I said, wait, you're not going to give that data point without giving your knowledge as the data, data gatherer, right? Like you must tell this politician that the demand for ebooks has gone really up high since 2020, right? We can't silo our data either. So we again opening that jar, right? It's not just that one data point will do it. And the second thing that happens for data people, and if there's anybody in the audience who you're really responsible for this, and I had a few questions in advance that suggest to me that there are some folks here, is that people who have not done the data collection, aggregation, cleaning, sifting, interpretation, and communication will ask for will ask for more data as soon as they see your report presented, right? I think this is why we end up making that mistake of overwhelming people with our spreadsheets. Has anybody, I've done that. Has anybody ever done that? It's a thing we do because we're trying to like pre-game, like we have answers here. Please look at our data. Please don't ask new questions before we've actually given you a full story of what this data means. So data experts steward data, but they also have context knowledge. They also have a real understanding about the system through which data was gathered and what could be next. We all know this about our own research, right? And data experts in libraries are doing research for those libraries. The second concept is critical storytelling, which means being conscious of power, who benefits and who loses, and representing people with dignity. I draw here on European traditions of the Frankfurt School philosophers, American traditions of critical race theory, first authored by Kimberly Crenshaw, and Data Feminism, recent book by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. People are impacted by the social conditions of their lives in ways that often determine whether or not they have the power to change them. So we have to think rationally and with healthy skepticism about what is, what might be, and what should be. And this means getting a little more savvy than our field has been about how we tell certain stories. The metaphor of the water fountain works on multiple levels here, but let me tell you a story about an elected leader who advocates for unhoused people in my region privately sharing a story with me about requesting a new water fountain to be installed in a downtown plaza. It's tough to get to water in this part of the city if the buildings aren't open, if it's after hours. But publicly they asked for this change so that dogs and babies and nursing mothers could easily access water during festival days when the town is sort of full of life. She shared with me that, quote, the city officials won't do it for homeless people. Everybody wants dogs and babies to have water, but not, quote, the homeless. So all the versions I've just told you of this story are true. If a water fountain were installed, dogs, babies, and people would all benefit from the new water fountain. Which version of the story is told is something we have to discern quite a bit about, because although it is desirable to change hearts and minds, I don't necessarily need to change hearts and minds or challenge the audience's biases in order to get a new water fountain installed. So you can think of it this way. If a subset of true stories achieves the desired result and aligns with the facts and library values, then choose a true story that resonates most with the audience. Those are the kinds of things we bring together in critical data storytelling, because critical data storytelling requires understanding power dynamics from a storytelling perspective. So let me tell you about the history of this work. Carolyn Hewins in the Fabulous Hat was a very early woman to be a public library director at a time when the field was 80% male, exclusively, racistly, all white, and 80% male. She was one of 5 women who introduced the systematic use of empirical evidence to librarianship. Before this time, it was male experts sharing their reflections at ALA conferences where they were not allowed to speak. Women could not speak in ALA conferences when she started this work, and it was actually in the 1870s when she began. Nonetheless, with 5 colleagues, they created a series of qualitative survey-based reports. And what's really interesting, and I published about this in 2009, and it won a nice award from ALA. And you can see the citation at the bottom. What's really interesting to me is this research model changed the field. It introduced surveys and a collaborative model of discourse around them. So I like to say that these are our data storytelling predecessors. These are our ancestors, if you will, in the field. And we have this task now as culturally competent librarians, not only to see power, but also to reorder things so that systems improve. So let me move on. That's a quote from the book too. So let me move on to data. And now when I go to data, I'm going to go right to the place that I directed you to. And so that was into this motivations and goals. And when you see motivations and goals, they're orange and blue. These are Illinois colors. You get to pick one, like sharing your achievement and you're serving real needs. And you get into achievement and serving real needs. And then there's a data story format that you can adapt. It's not meant to prescribe anything. There's an example. And then there's a particular real story example that usually we've got a few typos because it's a project where I'm hiring. It's a large team, there's a lot of moving parts, a couple typos, but this one's lined up well. Analyzing results from a patron survey and changing investments in technology is a great example. And here's a particular news story from Emory University Libraries. We have one, two, three, four news stories like this for each of these cases so that you can think about how that logical structure might work for you. Okay, so you've seen it in action. So let me go back and talk about it in concept. So we started with motivation. So we'll start on the right. So you choose first, why do you think you're telling this story, right? What do you think you're going to do? Are you sharing achievements? Are you trying to force a comparison between yourself and another library? Excuse me. Excuse me. Goodness. Good morning for me. Um, are you benchmarking or are you justifying investments? Like we really need to do something. We've got to mobilize some resources. So that's one part of your data story logic. The other part comes straight from the data. We can't make this up. These are they're going to be actual kinds of evidence to support one of these goals, or maybe more. But I like to say one at a time for this pair of things. So we'll say understanding the real needs. Are we trying to figure it out still? But we've got some evidence now. We think we understand. Maybe that's a data search process. Serving real needs, building on strengths and addressing deficits. I like to put addressing deficits last because when we measure things, we often start to see deficits quickly. I think we underestimate the degree to which we should be building on strengths as well, especially if we are distinct regionally in some way. Then keeping those investments strong might be a really important motivation. Well, you might be able to use benchmarking to say, hey, we've got to keep this strong, right? So stories need to focus. One story is not going to solve all problems. Storytelling is amazing, it is not magic. So we have to identify motivations and goals. And these are in relation to some problem that we need to solve, something that we're trying to address. Maybe it's as dire as a case of threats of defunding a library. These are happening across the nation right now at a pace that's so fast we really can't keep up. Maybe it's just an administrator who thinks that all the new hires should be part-time staff rather than librarians with the expertise that librarians bring and have. And I got to tell you, the folks in our classes are learning this kind of stuff right now. So hiring somebody new out of school, it's a great time to do it. There's a lot of energy that has been a result of all of these unbelievable roller coasters of what it is to be a librarian today. So the goals don't dictate the data. The data indicates which of these goals are possible and relevant. And I want to reemphasize this is distilled wisdom from the research, from the patterns and stories. We started with interviews, we moved through to workshops and focus groups. These are patterns that have worked for real people, tested and refined with librarians. So now let me show you what the back end looks like, which is this matrix. And I don't expect you to read all of that. I told you I was guilty sometimes of sharing my spreadsheet. I am. But the idea here is that this is the foundational logic of a data story. And this is what we need to move through the data sources that I'm going to touch on next. I did have someone mention iPads, so I'll go on from this for now because I'll bring it back to show a couple of examples. I had someone mention iPads. I actually didn't include that in the book, but of course now that that has been discontinued, I really wish I had. Because we need to know about these things. I'm very concerned about Public Library Survey. I'm very concerned about ACRL benchmark and PLA benchmark. I know Project Outcome well, and I wonder how they're going to make it through these times because all of these organizations I'm listing right now, none of them are not financially challenged. There's a huge amount of challenge going on. And of course, IMLS was threatened with complete defunding in the spring. Grants in the blue states have started back up, but not in the red states because of a case that was won in Rhode Island. You may know all this, but everything I'm talking about is funded by one IMLS grant that we completed, and then another one that is on the way. I thought there might be news about that soon. Thanks, Erica. I started to say that out loud and realized I wasn't sure it was my news to share yet. So I appreciate knowing that that's out there. So we have national organizations with data tools. I would say where I'm focusing these days is on regional information, regional consortia or systems. For you all with academic libraries, it may not be school districts and housing services as much, although it might be useful to know the rates of homelessness in your areas just in case. But transit systems, geographic access and barriers, how are people getting to and from the library? Because we absolutely know that getting to that academic library makes a difference. So there is also data at the level of your library, and everybody has something like this. Foundations is what it says here. It could easily say advancement. I did 4 years of trainings with the University of Illinois across Chicago, or Champaign-Urbana and Springfield. So the whole University of Illinois system. So I'm very familiar with advancement. I've published on advancement as well. But you can think of these categories of local data that if we can compare them regionally can be especially helpful. Things like budgets, what kind of community engagement and outreach is happening. That includes campus communities, right? I mean, these are your audiences. Um, Foundations and advancement, physical plant, we all have them. We can't always get them improved, but we all have them. And use of library services. What's the use like? But I think use should not exist alone because, like I mentioned with the example from Denmark, yes, Christina, happy to share the slides. In fact, there's already a link, I think, earlier in the chat where you can see, the example from Denmark was a great example of a data point about circulation being almost used to justify cuts. But that is not how it ended up happening. So yeah, perfect, Susan. Thank you. Because we talked about it and they realized that they needed to be the experts on that data. I've been teaching online since 1998, so I go back and forth between chat and slides really easily. In fact, I almost can't help myself. So you just keep them coming. But big questions, deep questions, I'd say save those for the end if you would. That would be great. So back to the matrix, let's take an example of benchmarking and addressing deficits. So you can benchmark what's going on in a region, let's say the state of Illinois, and three groups. So there are three major systems in Illinois. There's the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Illinois. I don't know if any of you know Ann Craig, the amazing Ann Craig, who's retiring in December. And then also Illinois Heartland Library System and Rails came together because they found this benchmark to address deficits, that there was a low benchmark on 1.5 million residents without access to the internet or computer equipment in their households. Household internet access is still very expensive. I've had students do research in the data storytelling classes on how it's extra punitive sometimes to folks who need to rent rather than buy equipment because that rental fee will go on much longer than the initial purchase fee, but the purchase fee is higher to begin with. So please do consider knowing if your library offers free broadband for anybody who walks in, consider knowing the dollar value of that for a household in your region. I think it's important. Um, there are also other benchmarks to address deficits that include the Urban Library Trauma Study. And I learned about this from Leah Dudek, who's a PhD student at Syracuse right now, so in New York, about the ways that trauma-informed strategic planning can help put a focus on the workers that problems most impact because they're already in multiple ways under greater stress. And so this is a process of researching, looking at what's missing to build up something that could begin to ameliorate some of these problems. So another example would be serving real needs and justification. So we know we need to serve these real needs, but how are we going to justify the investment that it takes to do that? Well, let me go home for us to ACRL and just say, academic library use increases student success. This is not the only study that shows this. And in fact, I think have more in common than we often acknowledge between academic libraries, community college libraries, and school libraries, because they all have similar approaches to the student process, even though the students and their learning positions are really different in some ways. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, thank you, Susan. Great comment. It's good to know some of those statistics. It will help justify. So in this case, just if you use the library, you achieve higher levels of academic success, and there's some different measures for this. And I always like to point out the connection to school libraries because Keith Curry Lance started doing that work before the beginning of my career in the late 90s, and found that and is still doing this work. So in the slide project, most recently funded by IMLS, and there's an SLJ story about that school library journal. Um, they are still finding losses in school library availability, trends of replacing librarians with support staff. The losses are higher than financial pressures explain. And of course, places like charter schools that probably need them the most are not investing in school libraries. So I would call all of these different kinds of forms of data storytelling that require a thorough and active data storytelling life cycle. We are typically good at one and four. So this is straight out of the book. One is collection. We definitely collect. We collect for state required reports and other kinds of required reporting, and we store, right? And from year to year, we might have those same collections and storage processes cycle back through. We don't spend enough time generally, I don't think, in our field with creating meaning, and that means analysis and, of course, visualization and story crafting. But I'll tell you a story about visualization, which is when I was in Norway doing some consulting with the Bergen Public Library. They had sent me this amazing spreadsheet of all of these beautiful visualizations. In fact, it was 8 pages. It wasn't even one spreadsheet. It was 8 pages of data viz. And I had gone through it and I had translated the Norwegian, and I was really trying to figure out what this was and how I could help them tell stories with it. And I spent a long time with this data visualization package. And I got to the workshop and I said, okay, what stories do you want to tell? And it was complete silence. And I waited. And eventually a woman spoke up and said, this doesn't feel like our data because it's what we report. We have to report it for the state, for Norway. And this new data visualization package, we don't even really recognize how it looks. So the analysis process is more than data viz. Data viz, if it alienates us from the meaning in our own stories, does not get us where we need to go, which is story crafting. If you'd like to know more about research on data viz too, I've co-published on that with Angelica Loduca out of Italy. That's also in JSIST. Let me know these references are in the slides, but let me know if you want them in the chat too. And so we really talk about the step-by-step process of creating a story experience from data in that recent JSIST article. And finally, it's communication. And this is where I talk about storytelling, right? We need to rehearse as well as tell and present our stories. So rehearse, let me explain that just a little bit and I'll come back to it. You need somebody on your team who can hear your draft story and tell you back what they heard. So just be thinking about that as I go through. You can extend the life of your data with storytelling, but how is up to you and your particular libraries. Ah, great, Marian. I can grab that while we're chatting in the meantime. Uh, Duca, there it is. So think about this. If we were doing a workshop, we would actually spend some real time on this. But think about this a little bit, and what all needs to happen to get from where you are to where you need to be. And let's go to audiences, because audiences are those people who, if we are lucky, there's that article, will retell our stories for us. I'm coming back to the storytelling triangle to emphasize the dynamic relationship between, and also to say there's about a chapter and a half on this in the book. It's actually fairly complicated. But the reason it shows up here is because people will tell you to know your audience, but they don't tell you how. And in our toolkit and in my book, We tell you how. We think you should look at three different features, and that is, you're welcome, Marion. That is their knowledge. So, what does the audience know and not know, if you can tell that? What are their demographics? Although it's careful, it's important to be careful with demographics because demographic data, usually socially constructed categories of various kinds, will not tell you about people's knowledge. And neither of those two things will tell you about people's attitudes, and both are important. But, demographics does come down to things like what role does somebody have? So straight out of that article with Loduca that I just posted, we found that it's useful to think with transforming data viz into data storytelling about three kinds of audiences: the general public, executives, and professionals. So the general public is when we're trying to reach way out there, how, people who need to know our story, maybe even at the level of state justification or for private folks at the level of, who is the foundation talking to, where are they looking outward in advancement strategies. Another one is executives. So this is the case I talked about before with like a politician in Denmark or the city council in the local homeless services, unhoused people, services for unhoused people in the local context I work in, that I live in, I should say. I tend not to work here as much as I do other places, honestly. Executives, this is who needs high level overview, who needs strategic decision making support. So critical metrics and trends and a kind of business outcomes approach is going to work best for executives. Now, business outcomes approaches don't always work for us, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I think libraries and nonprofits need their own approaches to storytelling that get beyond the things that presume that everyone is a consumer of products, right? I know we've called our patrons customers and customers patrons, but I don't think we mean customer like other people mean customer. But the executives do have this role of business outcomes. Now, professionals, that's you. That's us here in this room today. You are the people who need to have detailed insights to understand what's really going on behind this data. And that means you need each other. You need people to connect with. So this is where you add things like numbers, statistics, information to understand insights deeply and communicate them effectively. Now, types of audiences got complicated when we got into the research because this is a good general template for thinking about where you want to go with your data viz, and now you've got the longer article as well. But when we get into the toolkit itself, we found we needed to make a guide to audience attitudes because we had four kinds of audiences that had attitudes that shared us the same reality. Those are positive, negative, mixed, and indifferent audiences. So when I say positive and negative, I mean positive or negative about a particular decision being made in a particular room, Zoom or physical, where people are likely to vote on the outcome, and that vote in some way, maybe it's formal, maybe it's consensus, maybe it's some other decision-making process, but groups of people are going to make a decision. And if folks are divided on what they think, then they can have a civic civil conversation about what's going on there. You keep building trust even if people are positive. There's a lot of focus on persuasion for these shared reality if they're negative, mixed, or indifferent. Mixed audiences that you need to have somebody be able to say, well, this is why I changed my mind in a way that doesn't alienate them from the process. And indifferent people have to they need to know why it matters for them, and they need to see that there could be interest in this, right? Polarized audiences are newer. I went so a side story. I don't, anybody remember New College of Florida being in the news a few years back? This small liberal arts college that was once the honors program of the state. That's my Me Too, Victoria. I graduated in 95. Wow, how cool. So I helped to found the coffee shop that was a student co-op that is now run by a corporate coffee deal maker with cups with Bible verses on it. It is nothing against the Bible, but this is not public education, right? This has been turned into, April, thank you for saying that. Yeah, this has been turned into something that's much more like a Christian athletics college than which is indeed what it was modeled on with this remake. So, my point about polarized audiences is when people are actively spreading misinformation or disinformation, then we have to take a different set of approaches than when we are in a shared reality context. We stay on message. We do not repeat false information. Oh, those academic librarians are all a bunch of terrible word here. Children's librarians have gotten the worst of this, by the way, but all those academic librarians are all a bunch of terrible word here. Never say, no, we're not terrible word here. Don't give them the word back. Don't say it. Don't repeat the phrase. This is another takeaway for me. Please never repeat the horrible things that people are accusing us of. Also, consider the value of debate strategically. If somebody has got really polarized points of view, you may not want to have an open debate because a lot of folks with polarized points of view in this day and age are being trained by national organizations on how to shut down debate or make it look like a debate while actually undermining a position that would come forward more in a civic civil debate discourse. So if the intent is to confuse the voters or to disinform them, but certainly even just to confuse them is enough to keep a vote from happening, then you want to avoid debate. This is really important. I saw what happened with New College from an alumni perspective. I stayed deeply involved. My advisor was the provost just before all this happened. I've been there, I've visited, I've seen the athletic fields that have been installed on campus. The debates didn't work, and they won't work if there's active mis or disinformation happening. So, your third takeaway of the day. It is important and difficult to put to put data into tellable story form. That's our first goal, though, is to get data into story form. Our second goal, and I alluded to this earlier, is to rehearse with allies who can not just tell you what's wrong with your story. Don't ask for feedback right away. Put your data into story form, take it to an ally, and tell them, please tell me back what you just heard, right? Ask them to repeat your story to you. Because if they can repeat the key points, then someone else can hear that story and repeat it when you're not in the room. This is our goal with data storytelling. And it comes out of the long tradition of humanities scholarship based on folklore. And this is a way of visualizing what happens with those stories that last hundreds and thousands of years, which is, I've always been deeply interested in this, as well as our own libraries. So it's the retelling that really matters. So test it out, test your retelling out with people. I don't know if my stories are going to last nearly that long, but I'm interested in things that last. And I think aiming for a lasting story is what's going to make a difference. So you can be thinking about, and I'm noticing the time and I'm going to have to zip through some things. You can be thinking about which audiences could be retelling your stories. Now, in the book, I have multiple narrative strategies. I'm not actually going to show you all of them right now. I'm just going to go to three structures rooted in both narratology and in the research that we've done, although with refined terms. We use these terms rather than other things as classic ways that emotion and information are connected. In continuity, we have so continuity stories we undertell, and they're really important. Continuity stories are about lasting through challenge. If you've got a challenge, and you've persisted through it, you have a story about lasting. Most of us have stories that have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 about how our libraries adjusted what they were doing in some way. Some full physical shutdowns, some not. It depends on the region and the place. But stability and resilience despite challenges is a really robust way to connect your information with an emotional arc. And I won't go into a lot of this today, but there's like a whole chapter on each of these things really each of the three ways of doing narrative. This is just one of the ways of doing narrative that I have in the book. Transformation is the one we think about. And the only problem with that is Campbell actually researched the major figures of religions, so Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. And I like to say, we are not them, we are regular people. So when we have awe at transformation, we don't want to tell this story about ourselves or probably even about our own libraries. We want to tell this kind of story about the people who have benefited from the work we have done, the students whose scholarship plus time in the library have led to amazing outcomes, and they've gone on to do wonderful things. That is the joy of watching a hero triumph. And then discovery is the most complex one. I won't go into it a lot here, but it comes from Roland Barthes, so good old French theory, SZ, where he unpacked a Balzac novella to the ends of the earth and almost broke structural analysis and kind of opened the door to post-structuralism in certain ways. But the idea here is that you need to create mystery, suspense, and intrigue if you're going to give a walkthrough of data. It's really important that you not walk through data and assume that people are asking the same questions you are asking when they are looking at the data. I have seen so many presentations die. I have had my own presentations. Like every mistake is one I've made, right? Like I've seen my own presentations die on the vine when I cannot get people interested in the questions that are behind what I'm asking. So that thing of research questions, it's more than um, good practice in research. It's actually an orienting way in a narrative sense to create suspense and intrigue and to bring the audience with you in satisfaction when you come to understand something. Okay, so actually, I talked about this one before, so I'm going to skip it. And I'm going to skip this one too right now. But you can think about engaging your audience in a storytelling relationship while I go on to talk about resilience, because I actually think this is a really important topic for our times. And I have about 4 minutes to cover it. So I think I can do that. For library advocates to stay motivated these days, we need to find some strategic and practical grounds for everything we're doing. Um, so a stance against censorship in particular requires intellectual and emotional strength. It may or may not require that right now in your communities, but it might. I've seen public library boards taken over in Illinois by people who were interested in shutting the library down. So it may require intellectual and emotional strength right where you are. I like to tell this story, highly anonymized, of a small town, it's a medium-sized library, of a library board tasked with approving plans for a building expansion. But there was a catch. In a secret meeting, the mayor demanded that the library director change the building plans and reduce the square footage of the planned expansion by almost 25%. The library director was forced to work with the architects to do this and was told to tell no one, not even the board, who was about to vote on the proposal, or he would be fired. You know that large amounts of data can be confusing even to the best public servants, and they can be overwhelming. The mayor was counting on no one noticing those last-minute changes. The library director did not go direct into battle over this. Instead, he talked with staff who had trusted relationships with people who could get word to the city council, got words back that the plans had been altered without a process. Then the library board members, who by this point had voted on the plan, were alerted. City officials demanded to see the original plans. Library board demanded to re-vote on this issue. Thanks to motivated public officials and a budget that could handle the expansion, the originally planned renovations were completed, and that mayor was not reelected. My point here, library misinformation is not new. It is not, it may be more widespread, it's more organized, but people using disinformation tactics and hoping others will spread misinformation is not new at all. So in chapter 5 of the book, I describe several approaches to these very difficult situations, and I'll talk about two of them. First, let's draw from what we know from history. Let's remember professional ethics. There are so many competencies, ethics statements, documents like, things like the Library Bill of Rights, our ALA competences. Um, that's bedrock for us. And then another bedrock is defending institutions because the defense of libraries is the only way that future generations are going to have libraries. We need people to learn what the library is, has done, and will do for them so that they are positioned to act by speaking up about its value and supporting it. Finally, we need to make eye contact and small talk. I know, as much as I think anyone can, how tempting it is to disengage during times of stress. But these gestures acknowledging shared humanity build the possibility of common ground beyond whatever the current conflict may be. So that's one approach. In the book, I talk about addressing polarized audiences in detail as a process that's outlined here, but I won't go into it. I talk about it both in relation to this library blueprint changing fiasco that I know is a true story, although it's anonymized. I also talk about it in relation to the book banning itself and walking through how this would work to identify the problem, determine what to do, when to persuade and when to avoid debate, and staying on message. So you can think about which stories will amplify the resilience of your library, but I wouldn't be doing my resilience job if I didn't tell you one last story before I open for questions. And that is As I was finishing the book, my grant was terminated as well. It followed the March 14th executive order by the president. DOGE worked on dismantling the IMLS. I'm sure many of you were connected also to people who got reduction in force notices that described the jobs as abolished. Many times this has brought to mind my grandfather, Frank B. Parsons. We called him Papa Frank. He came home from World War II back to the Birmingham region of Alabama, having seen a kind of injustice that changed his already generous spirit and opened his eyes. As the city attorney of Fairfield, Alabama in the 1960s, when the Ku Klux Klan spread flyers declaring that they were planning a march, and this is a suburb of Birmingham, he defended the city and won all the way up to the Alabama Supreme Court in 1962. Let's think about that for just a second. This is not the picture we have of Alabama in 1962, right? Then he argued the case before the US Supreme Court in 1963, and you can see the document there in the middle, and he lost because we win some and we lose some. But he never stopped working for justice. My mother and uncles describe his law office waiting room as one of the most integrated places in the Birmingham region. In a context where racism was rampant and normal, he practiced law to help others, no matter their race or income. And I remember people stopping by the house in summer with vegetables as thanks. One of my uncles remembers a man who brought payment in socks. Papa Frank was a really quiet man, but he also served on the school board and advocated for desegregation, while my grandmother, Elizabeth Reams Parsons, who's in her fabulous hat there, Mama Lib, served on the library board and advocated for literacy for all. And they really meant for all, even in this context. At his funeral, the First United Methodist Church in Fairfield was overflowing with the most integrated crowd I ever saw in all our visits to Alabama. And at the bottom left is a picture of me as a kid with Papa Frank and my brother Danny and my cousin Beth on his knee. My cousin David wasn't born yet, but that's us. What I know is that he gave me an invitation. I think Carolyn Hewins gives us all an invitation, as with her fabulous hat, to become storytellers. We need to honor and amplify these traditions that have been inclusive and hopeful and radiantly successful. There are so many more books I could recommend to you. I should tell you that Dr. Nicole Cook is the editor of the book of the series that my book is in. This is the third book in the Critical Cultural Information Studies series. I highly recommend to you her edited volume, The Legacy of Black Women in Librarianship When They Dared to Be Powerful. And I also really enjoy this book, Strengthening Library Ecosystems. I have more books I could recommend. I have more things I could talk about, but that is my time. I want to say thank you and invite your questions. I really quickly have to flash to this slide to say, I could not do this without collaborators. I am indebted to these people and more for keeping me together, body and soul, sometimes with tape and string during all of these processes. So thank you so much for listening. That link is one that I will just copy and bring to you. When I have new research projects to put out there, I invite people through my LinkedIn account. So if you'd like to connect there, please feel free to do so. And thank you again. I'd be happy to take your questions. And I'll stop the sharing so we can actually look at each other if that's, oh, yep, and here's our Q&A. Great. Yeah. How do you determine the cost of internet per household? So that's an open question. I'll be happy to take that one. My student did this work. You have to look at a particular region, and if there are multiple options, you need to research all options, but just approach it like you're a customer. I mean, that's what you should do, is approach it like you're a customer and then look in what's available. And then if you've got just one kind of thing available, you'll have to share that one. If you've got three plans, honestly, I think only in very large urban areas would you have more than five options for actual household internet, right? Like three is pretty normative across the US. And many rural places have one plan, and that's what they've got. So it's great you asked that question because it indicates to me that you are in a place that has multiple options. So yeah, it takes more research to do that. It does. But thank you, Christina. Thank you so much for all of you who are listening. And are there other questions I can answer? I'll share one people ask a lot, which is, are people's stories data? And I often say that's a great question, but they're not data unless they were collected systematically. And they're not shareable unless people are either highly anonymized or You have enthusiastic consent for sharing their story. Enthusiastic consent for sharing their story also means thinking about, does the person wish to be anonymous or wish to be credited, right? Because sometimes, like the student who did, I didn't give the slide, so I didn't mention his name, but Justin Martin is one of my former students who did the research in the Chicago area on what internet access actually cost for families in 2020. And that was it's really good work, right? Like it's a really eye-opening kind of work. So yeah, so people's stories could be data if collected systematically. I do a lot of qualitative research myself, as you've seen. I believe in the power of qualitative research to help us understand the context for various kinds of numeric statistical counting-based data. I like both. I think they're both really interesting and important. Um, but yeah, so those are the kinds of things I often get asked, and it's all just to say that like stories are super important, but even an anonymized amalgamated story should conform closely to the data that you have, so that we are able to back it up with data and not sharing anecdotes. And I think this is where we've got a lot more anecdotes than we have systematically collected stories. And that's normal. Like this is our a lot of industries have that. We are challenged in terms of time and focus. And I really do get that, but it's building it into the data collection processes that will help that to happen. So I'm riffing because there are no questions, but those are some things I usually get asked. I did have some questions about data visualization. I think data visualization is important, but like I said, it has its limits, and we've overestimated what those viz packages are going to do. I just want to be clear about that because I've seen it again and again now, like a lot of staff investment in Power BI these days, but the good old Excel spreadsheet and how to do fancy things with that. I mean, a lot of what I've done has always been with Excel spreadsheets, and it works well enough. It's not the ultimate data viz we're going to put out with the project. We have that under development right now on the second grant. We've been able to mobilize a little of that money to keep things moving. But data viz alone isn't going to answer the questions. I think this work is meant to add a layer of nuance, because right now the data viz packages we have are all aimed toward those business mindsets. And we are not mostly businesses. And as academic libraries, we aren't even tuition revenue generating units. I hate that phrase. I really hate that phrase. Every time I hear it, I'm like, this is not going well, right? So we have to find ways to work around the constraints of the situations and systems that we're in, and also to document our value. Like we are extremely valuable, but we're not always doing the things that are needed to tell those stories and get other people to tell them when we're not around to do it ourselves. In the long run, none of us are around to do it ourselves. This is a long game, right? Like we're all here temporarily at our libraries. That's how it is. So you can think of this as your own investment in the future too.